Yeah, previously I had mentioned um, some issues I've been thinking about as far as like, predominantly, in most of all my, uh, I don't know if I'd really call it spare time, but while I do considerable amount of like thinking about quite a bit about my direction in alphanumerics and linguistics and practical application, integration, compatibility, analytical, and all types of terminology, um, where it's at and that way. But anyway, it had led to, here recently thinking about the Lexus Nexus and the Westlaw and alignment to parallel universe and my thoughts thinking along the lines of the writs for habeas corpus by representation of it seemed to be like the three factors of whether if it is a demanded requirement of three, which very well may be. I mean, that's the part that seemed to be whether or not if it's going to be an issue of what I see of similarity of intersecting axes of like Audi. And the thing about an alignment, a parallel universe, and like a World Series type of thing about it, and why one pronoun of the four types of pronouns cannot be used as a subject. And how true that is, it really only based upon my thought of like what the equator is to a degree level of reference standards of consensual participation. Seemingly the word, it seemed to be like really the only word that has the significance of a connectivity relation between architecture and platform. And then there's the embedding and encryption. It seems to be the issue about what availability means, and more so, I mean, as far as like a computer programming and language, it seems to be the issue there, kind of like a Y1 pronoun of the four types of pronouns, and even the quadrants of the rectangle on the tennis court between like Y2K terminology as compared to the thought of Abraham Lincoln uh, thing about night vision in the way of like a Lincoln Continental hood ornament being in my mind, like a quadrant of like, even the spherical quadrants of like of globalization of like the world map and what the spherical quadrants is as two-dimensional as compared to three-dimensional and all that between the pi r squared and exponential quotients of powers of multiplication and here recently, my thought thinking about the NAFTA, North American Free Trade Act, and the NATO, North Atlantic Treaties Organization. And the P in the placement, it seemed to be like the connectivity of like Apple iPhone SE, and a distinguishable difference of like pronunciation being the SE, being, like a, yes, yet in pronunciation likewise, in addition, vision. And the connectivity between the word vision being 88 and plural being with the S, an additional 19 being like um, 107 visions, and what that is to quantum and in that way of alphanumerics and linguistics and placement geographics and factors involving methods of banking and all kinds of stuff that seem to be ultimately getting to the root 66 and what internet protocol is to a local area network or the thought of maybe something beyond the front lines to the beachfront of international financial management of sand software equating like what's dictated on or offshore by means of whether or not that's just the thought of what a degree level might only mean as compared to non-degreed of international law having fair use as an access easement to even an entire neighborhood, um, or what it really is in the way of like world class, world history, or the thought of like a province. So it seemed to be like the deal going back, and I'd mentioned previously like yesterday about Richard Nixon. It seemed to be like during that time, during and I'd mentioned like the before and after, and it seemed to be like a 3 month period, comparable to even the quadrant of like the Abraham Lincoln night vision of like the hood ornament, the rectangle on the Lincoln Continental being like a quadrant of like a four. Rectangles equating to the square, and ultimately, getting to like global positioning systems and VSAT technology of the KU bands that's identified. And how true it is, I mean, if it's limited to KU bands based upon whether or not if it's only representing a non-degreed issue in the way of like color code and space exploration or um, what family law is or is not, just because of a caviar making it behind the front lines of the beachfront, around the Prince of Wales, and the thought of like primate spawning, and ultimately it seemed to be like the issue really, of a black dot on the map, and whether or not a family law is even a reality, with or without gravity, or what degree level is, or in that way, or in my case, being a drummer, it seemed to be like a real big deal about Remo black dot drum heads. And now, what I used back then was predominantly, Remo black dot drum heads, and now Aquarian power white dot drum heads, is predominantly it. It does seem to be like the two that, I mean, out of like many drum heads, I mean, those were really my preference, whether or not the color code or anything I'm talking about, black dot on the maps, or power white dots. But that really, really is, ultimately, my preference, and no matter what the situation. But ultimately, it got into the pastel colors of Univision. It was like just a drive-by thing, like back then, back in the 80s, to the drum shop on Highway 59, Southwest Freeway, at Chimney Rock. And all those years going there, it was like during the Remo Black Dot thing, before Univision actually built and set up right there on the West Loop 610, right at Highway 59, right on the outside of Loop 610, on the inner diagonal side going towards the southeast, with the Houston Post. And it seemed to be like the real big deal in my mind, even the game Connect 4, and during that time, the game Battleship, and the Code Red thing, and the pegs, and some like religious issue reflecting, if it's a UListic thing of like Yul Brynner and the Ten Commandments, or something about escrow in a way of like a pagan idolatry, or a color code of like non-degreed issues of just something like the deal about caviar and primate spawning, of like maritime law, or what that is, and I don't mean to sound like like a economic plea bargain, Ponzi scheming, raffling voucher auctioning, clearance and warehousing, but it seemed to be the thing about the similarities of, a little bit of humoring about Anyway, it seemed to be like it gets to the point that Univision had used predominantly 4 sets of colors, and 3 of them, without the doubt, is the pastel, and the one set of 4 being with 1 black, and at a different time, which was the last, was the 3 pastels with a white. And the only thing I'm really not sure, if white can be considered both a pastel and just a regular color, and I'm really not sure about that, and it might be exactly that. I'm not real sure about that yet. When I feel the need to know, well then I will. But anyway, it seemed to be the deal about Univision there at West Loop 610 and Highway 59, about the pastel being 73 in Harris, Egypt, and the Israeli, ultimately getting to the Israeli flag, and quite a bit. But anyway, my thing about talking about referring to like LexisNexis and Westlaw seem to be, I mentioned previously that Westlaw seemed to be predominantly based upon, my thoughts of like the Delta Force and electronic power being 181, Houston, Texas, and we International, or, the thought of like a attenuation USA, alphanumerics USA, Pearland, Texas, Highway 59, alphanumerics like Highway 59 USA, and, the alphanumerics of 140, Pearland, Texas, and a Purple Heart, and all kinds of stuff that, geographically, right here on the south side of the Houston area, it presents, the thing about the attenuation being, digital signal processing and processing speed, that seems to be the coordination between, beyond the thought of like measuring cycles per second and oscillation of frequency, predominantly, the thing about the 13 band graphic equalizers. And the only 2 that I know of, and it seemed to be the only thing that I'm aware of being of the 13 band graphic equalizers, is once again the pastel green and pastel red. The pastel green being the ambience, and JVC was the only one that I know of that had the pastel green, showing that the ambience is the pastel green, measuring density in nano units. It's like an LED light, okay, but it represents the ambience that way. And then the pastel red There were two. One was Mexico. It was the pyramid of 13 band graphic equalizer. I'm thinking it was from Mexico. And in Texas, I mean, like in my life, anything from Mexico, I mean, was like really not normal at all. But that was available, and I actually got it, and that was one of them. And there's another one with the U.S. patent that was back then in the 80s. I'm actually trying to place it, but predominantly, ultimately, I got with the Clarion was like really ultimately my favorite, regardless about the night vision thing about the pastel colors, pastel red and pastel green. But it seems to be the significance of like world history identifying the before and after and during the Richard Nixon with like I mean, if it just has to represent like the four quadrants of the rectangle on the tennis court, or the hood ornament of Lincoln Continental, or Abraham Lincoln being the only one predominantly studying at night, seemed to be the deal about night vision. And night vision that way, the pastel green, pastel red during world history and education, reflecting that the pastel green, most definitely, identified the province that way of world history. Yet, it's the world class thing about the current event, the current affair, and what television is, of like legal media and deposition that way, and not necessarily the thought of like just a flat plane surface of a book, or two dimensional in the way, or even a method of banking that way of just like just paperwork as compared to the human factor, and what degree level is as compared to a non-degree, or gee, thought you knew kind of like thing. But anyway, it's kind of like it seemed to be like the going a little bit beyond and practical application, because even certain issues of like factors of participation, or knowing how to use what has been accomplished as some thought of acquiring a direction that would provide a means of like value, whatever that may be a person chooses, normally a direction, motivation of like, if it just has to be funds as compared to the categorization of money, or the thought of earned annuity, is probably the Smith and Barney, the old-fashioned way, earned it, so anyway, I mean, if it's ultimately getting to the thought of like, what annuity is as a given based upon it being earned, whether a point of origin was just, generations of, that actually happening, as compared to maybe, well, it might be in some people's mind like an alignment of parallel universe, or don't be fooled by imitations, or um, intellectual easements being used as a standard that might give the impression, yet a standard within itself. But it seems to be sometimes constitutional law of like having a right to assemble, or what that is in aggregates, or anything representing the freedom of speech and the freedom of press, and in the form of what normally intellectual easements provide is the idea and thought, and what value is, as a memory of an easement. Yet still kind of like the ergonomic factor, but yet used as a standard, and whether that reflects a method of banking as human capital at a degree level, yet at a non-degree level, it would present maybe, hey, there's an equator and operator involved, and, the Better Business Bureau, and, I mean, if it really ultimately gets to, it seems to be the deal about the equator and the ground zero thing, and some halo venue and all that white stuff, beyond a halo venue. The schematic, it's like, hey, you were baptized during the Gold Rush, weren't you? Yeah, you were on the stagecoach, right, on that J. Edgar Hoover amphibious halo schematic platform, canvassing the absentee voting of the ecclesiast. Yeah, you were on the stagecoach, sitting on your VSAT ecclesiast. Yeah, sure. Not that it has to be absentee voting with the book of Ecclesiastes, you know. But yeah, yeah, you were baptized during the Gold Rush, with some like prepaid postage of Calamity Jane, right? Well, anyway, yeah. So like, it seemed to be like ultimately getting to the Golden Gates and the four acronym TDCJ, and what that is to world history in the way of Richard Nixon. Okay, Nixon being 76, yet at the same time, Nixon being 76, and during that time, the before Richard Nixon 3 months would be like a quadrant, and that's the way really it is with international financial management of globalization. Is, I mean, like the word um, globalization, and predominantly, with the world as a globe divided in what looks like a two plane spherical quadrant of like like a football, but the thing of it is that's really how it's divided. You've seen it. I'm sure pretty much everyone's seen the world globe divided in quadrants looking like four, shapes of footballs. Or, the thought of the Oval Office, or, some idea of compatibility in relation, okay? But in any case, yeah, so like it gets to it, and what a two-dimensional surface only means to maybe the absentee thing, maybe representing like where's the isometrics, rising above it all, and the pi square factor, using the thought of like I mean, if it's ultimately getting to the pi squared representing two 9-hole golf courses, or the thought of 18-hole golf courses in the way of totaling like 36, or some idea of like telepathic and a TP thing of like what the thought of like implementation at a political science means of terminology would represent maybe an evolution that might represent something beyond the plantation and color code, or the thought of implementation at a political science, or the thought of sanitation or U.S. constitutional law having a right to assemble, or what that is in import and exporting, or what the circuit is, and if it really represents the thought of like how incorporation is actually manufactured based upon, I mean, if it just has to be the word demographics, um, I don't know if I would maybe even limit it or even really use that word based upon, I mean, ridiculously pronunciation, or the same sort of difference of what a libertarian might only suggest as maybe maybe the thought a libertarian might only present maybe had it been unisex, or compatible of like co-ed in a way of like a men and women, boys and girls, and the guy gal thing, or whatever the case may be. I mean, if libertarian only suggests maybe whether or not if the thought of compatibility is not necessarily a segregation based upon gender alone, or what normally dictates predominance in a way of like I don't necessarily think that it would rule out anything other than, at a certain level as maybe favoritism compared to what anatomy provides, as, a requirement, or whether it's, just a compliment, or the responsibility, and or for including, representation that would provide in a way that way. But anyway, so in any case, yeah, so like I was thinking about that because LexisNexis, and really what it is okay, is that I was thinking about Saturn's sky, and it looks like a smaller version of the Corvette. And the reason being, it's kind of like thinking about that is because of the colors of the rainbow. Excuse me. And Orion Performance Monitor, and I mean the book cover of the Orion Performance Monitor involving like networking with all the hot air balloons. It's ultimately because of a thing about Fort Stockton, Texas, and programming of like Friday Night Lights about the high school football team and the Permian Basin, and certain factors of Ector, and even the guitar, and the airline guitar, as well as like Emirates, and all the African American 71, and what we international seems to somehow have the connectivity of like Ector, or even the thought of like like a 1979 band thing. It's like it's like the moving pictures compact disc was given to me. But I mean, in any case, when I really started practicing my drums, I mean, I chose that as my first to actually completely learn, and it took me like about 18 months, 16 months to actually really get it. But it was like on a 5-piece drum set. In any case, so I mean, it has its issues already, but the thing with this is that when I decided to actually really get serious, I picked the hardest drummer available at the time. That was like, I mean, anyway, it was like Neil Peart and Rush. But anyway, like in history, world history is like it provides the information like Russia and Prussia, and kind of not insignificant, but Soviet Union wasn't quite the focus as terminology during that time. And the thing with this is that like Richard Nixon, okay, the thing about Flag Day was like, during that time going through education, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, okay, it was like are the three that were separated. How true that is about every description or administration within, if you want to call it, city municipalities, or what building structure is that way, or public or private, or I mean, if that represents some idea of like a duration of what Mercedes-Benz might only mean to maybe world news as being a money miracle, or even the alphanumerics of 72, the categorization of money, or the Brown thing, or what sanitation is to the thought of many factors. But I mean, if it seems to be like if it's an intellectual duration, it seems to be the significance of three. seems to be quite a bit the thing about Mercedes-Benz, or even the Delta Force, and like electronic schematics representing a triangle being the delta. The thing about even for sororities and fraternities or major universities, predominantly more so focusing on the electronic and electrical and electronic side, normally identified, in my mind, how true it is, it seems to be the sigma, alpha, delta, kappa, phi. And I'm not real sure if kappa is really always the issue, but it seems to be like the four about the sigma, alpha, delta, kappa, phi, but it's actually 5, okay? And in my mind, that's automatically the deal about maybe what a projected estimate might represent as a fixed cap beyond the norm. And anything beyond that would be maybe the thought of maybe, a fixed rate, maybe described maybe as a hedge, yet projected estimate. Um, and all that stuff about whether or not if inside trading information is only, it's kind of like, well, how could it not be? I mean, like, haven't you ever seen anything or know anything about the New York Stock Exchange? They talk all the talk about the inside trading information. And if that's only really whether or not if an exchange commission is only the issue, or de facto representing maybe some idea of like a, United States patents, copyrights, and trademarks as some idea of like litigation using writs of habeas corpus, and de facto in a way of maybe only what annuity might mean based upon, I mean, if it's, I don't know if I would actually choose the word dissolution, this dissolved or dissolution, and I know at certain levels that would represent maybe the thought of molecular composition, or it all looks together, but it's invisible and based upon, the idea of like adding a little bit of heat to it or whatever, and forming like a solid, based upon, like factors of like chemistry itself, or normally it's referred to sometimes that way of based upon my life, some idea of like a relation in a way of like some idea of like a degree level of like comprehending some kind of idea of like a relation that way that wouldn't be, and maybe an idea of like, a classified ad, of employment in some non-degreed issue of like what only availability means based upon, not having a total source of control for themselves that way, or the thought that Burning's being representative maybe only a black dot on a map, or whether if, I mean, really, I don't think anyone can probably convince me that family law is even a reality at certain factors, when based upon, my perception of like thinking that certain names, identities actually be like a, I don't want to say simulcast based upon maybe suggesting representation as some kind of a foreknowledge, or legal media and deposition in a way like what soap operas might even provide, representing in some idea of like a legal media and deposition that might even present whether if family law is even it, or legislative, executive, and presidential in a way of like corporate ventures and mergers based upon, I mean, who's getting married in maritime law, or who's not really thinking that liquidable equity is still the idea of maritime law, or expendable in a way, and not necessarily a degree level of like a multi corporations, or I mean, for real, what litigation, or excuse me, auditing, legal meeting, deposition, I mean, like live on air is to like the pronunciation of the word savior itself. Okay, like live on air is like 105, and even the spelling like in religious venues, sometimes savior is actually spelled with or without a U, or sometimes even with or without even an O, or sometimes even an I. I mean, I've seen, I think, if my memory serves me correctly, the word savior having one or the other like not there, and changing the alphanumeric value. Predominantly, more so in my mind, the I representing, the difference between 105 and the thought of um, maybe only the thought of maybe the I on the top side of the pyramid, or the word Adonai, right? Representing some concept of like um, of a deity as compared to maybe proper English numerical composition, or maybe the thought of interchangeability, maybe disregarded as insignificant, and maybe overlooked as not having the significance that maybe it should. like, the I, me, myself, and I thing in proper English numerical composition, first, second, and third person that way, or they and them, and yeah. In any case, and all that us stuff, yeah. So so like I was getting on the thought of like LexisNexis, and before I get too far off into it again, it seems to be like the difference of pi squared, um, once again, and the exponential quotients of powers of multiplication, because seemingly like a NAFTA, okay, it presents the F, and I've seen NATO referred to and talked to as like NATO, but I've seen it actually with a P, the NATO written while talked about it, okay, yet ignored like the P being silent like in NATO, but the P presented in that way while describing it as the acronym with a visible but not audible pronunciation of the P of NATO North Atlantic Peace Treaties Organization. And the difference between NAFTA and NATO with the P would be that exponential placement, even the degree of like a 0 degree in Fahrenheit or Celsius, and the placement of normally what a variable would be as an exponent in that way, or a degree, representing really both, really truthfully so at the same time, in placement, that way. And in NAFTA, I mean, with the C, it seems to be ultimately like through, like really decades of like studying alphanumerics and linguistics and all that, with practical application of principle and integration, compatibility, and analytical. I mean, it's really got symbolically that serious to me anyway, looking at it that way. But like NAFTA being the North American Free Trade Act, with the thought of like a symmetrical, asymmetrical thing of like 180 degree at a vertical would be like the C with like a capital F to the upper right, what would be actually representative of like a symmetrical, asymmetrical 180 that way of the letter C itself in placement and exponential placement, given the thought of an F in NATO being a P, as I've heard it and seen it, seen it as the NAPTO, or even the PTO of a tractor representative of a 3-point, once again, even the triangle schematic and all that stuff about protractor presenting, the 180 degree. Think about it, what compass bank is to quite about the degree that way. But anyway, so like it seems it gets to the Apple iPhone SE and the difference between the ERISA statute and the IRA, and the difference of the SE and the Apple iPhone SE that way. And it seems to be the thing about what I was ultimately getting to, of alignment of parallel universes compared to like the World Series, and my thought of Westlaw being predominantly of the thought of like the Delta Force, in the way of like ultimately Delta 88 and schematics of the triangle, and ultimately getting to why one pronoun can be used as a subject, because I mean even a pyramid has 4 sides, right? But yet a triangle representative of the delta, and even the thing about the sigma, alpha, delta, kappa, phi. In any case, so like the Nexus Lexus, anyway, I was thinking about that because, the smart car, smart for two, smart car, Mercedes-Benz in Sugar Land, Texas, on Highway 59, out in that area. At the time, it was like back in the 80s. Actually, I think it was like real close to maybe 1990, 92, and I think afterwards, likewise, around 1999. I went out there and just to look at it because, the smart cars, like smart is like 71 Pearland, okay? And so I went out there and likewise looking at the Scion IQ and the Saturn Sky. And the thing about there seems to be the significance about the Orion Performance Monitoring is that the hot air balloons on the Orion Performance Monitoring, the book cover, presents the issues of like the colors of a rainbow and the geoprism, Chevrolet geoprism, and diamond thing about the colors of a rainbow, and the luminance of like the prism of a diamond or a prism itself, presenting the colors of a rainbow, likewise colors of electrical and electronic color codes. But anyway, it seemed to be like measuring it in nano units, which is the thing of night vision being measured in nano units. And the hot air balloons presenting that once again of the difference in temperature and the altitude, presenting the condensation and evaporation that a hot air balloon really generates, the demanded requirements of even a rainbow in the atmosphere. So, it's kind of like something I was thinking about that involving, the Ector County the Hector's Fort Stockton, Texas thing about the alphanumerics of 200 and James Lenall unit in the way of like the alphanumerics and some factors of like an identical twin rainbow on a Saturday morning. And it seems to be the significance that way of the 180, almost like the LexisNexis and like Westlaw in a way of like an alignment in a parallel universe as compared to the World Series or the thought of pi r squared. It's like Y2K, it's like interchangeable, like even the tennis court. It's like it's interchangeable and interchangeable that way of like um, that in the way of like LexisNexis would give the impression of exponential questions of powers of multiplication, and like Westlaw would present the issue of like an alignment as a World Series as compared to like the LexisNexis of um, the exponential quotient of powers of multiplication as compared to pi r squared, which would give LexisNexis the presence of that, but um, really truthfully so and truthfully optional. I'm assuming that way of like two 9-hole golf courses, and why I focus on two 9-hole golf courses is because of the pastel green, okay, and ultimately it's getting to the jurisprudence and the colors of the sprite. Okay, and predominantly like even like British Petroleum in the beginning when I first really saw it, when British Petroleum became like a noticeable factor, moving into the Texas City, Texas area, is when I really paid attention to it and noticed the color code. Uh, and I didn't see it at the time. I think at the first it didn't have the yellow. Now it does have the yellow. The color of Sprite being like the pastel green and the green. And the same thing about the pastel green of province and world history as compared to the color of the jurisprudence. And with the black back is the thing about the book, jurisprudence, is the black back thing about it. And once again, it seemed to be like the thing about with British Petroleum, the BP being like the 18, or what the deal is with the two 9-hole golf courses, or the 18, the yellow. Yellow being 92 like Pentagon and Reserve Reverse and Drummer, and the yellow also like a right in the middle of the green and red of traffic light and signal traffic light and traffic control that way. Yet of the colors, yet saturation and hue and as compared to the pastel colors. And the thing about that, it seemed to be the deal about the band Yes, okay, during the 80s and their big generator. Compact disc with a yellow cover, big generator. It seemed to be the deal. It's just like it's automatically the yays and nays of like Washington D.C. and my thing about the province reflecting the pastel of a golf course and landscaping. I mean, it's like phenomenally some of the most beautiful landscaping like on the entire planet, truthfully so. And in any case, yeah. So like yet jurisprudence it presents a different color and of green. I'm not sure the exact name of the color, but my point being is that British Petroleum reflected, in if my memory serves me correctly, it was about just the same colors as Sprite, presenting the same colors of like the golf course being a pastel green, and the color of like Providence in world history during the time of like Richard Nixon. In my mind, it's like the rectangle of the Lincoln Continental of like Abraham Lincoln studying and the only person that I know of studying the dark of like night vision that way of like the pastel green and pastel red, and all the information that I've been referring to, and even the tennis court reflecting, the thought of like binary numbers in a way, only using to get a sequencing of characterization of four, which is a principle of like ACTP, colon double forward slash, and computer programming and language that way. And my thought about it really, it seems to be like ultimately it gets to the thought of like what Mercedes Benz is to the smart car, and as far as I know, at the time, a Mercedes Benz was the closest one that was like the only one that I felt like going to anyway. How true it is, if Mercedes Benz was the only one that was like selling like the smart car. Anyway, so I went there and was looking at it. Likewise with the Saturn Sky, and the reason why I'm thinking about the Saturn Sky is because like the colors of the rainbow. The Saturn representing what a ring is in my mind of ultimately getting done all that white stuff in the halo venue of like a color code of most porcelain toilets being white, and getting to the high yield silver thing of like the oldest governmental computer mainframe called the Whopper, And ultimately it gets to, the kingsmanship and the moat around the castle and what kingsmanship is or is not to, the English Parliament, or what that is even to a golf course in that way. Or, or what that is to a non-degreed issue, whether or not the citizenship birthrights has really maybe always been the issue of a non-degreed issue, whether it's a known or not known fact that way. Or what litigation and writs of habeas corpus only mean to, like, programming on television to the ban. And VSAT identifies KU ban as military function. And how true it is, if it's only limited to KU bans, that is the only information that I found studying about the VSAT communications and global positioning systems and communications involving satellite, because I was actually studying quite a bit about the telematics and like tracking systems, and that way of like manufacturers like OnStar is the General Motors, and GMAC, promissory notes, and the acronym 24 being my thought of like redundant frequency, and the RF, or the word free, and what the EE really is to that symbolic representation between the C and the PTIS on the backside of the US $1. It ultimately gets to the distinguished difference of the three most simplest ways of computation of that symbolic representation between it. It ultimately gets to 58, okay? And the one horizontal line, it seems to be the